Hello, everyone. Good morning. So thank you for joining us here in our optimal webinar series, the Global Leadership Effectiveness Study. It is a pleasure to see those again whom have joined our previous sessions, as I do see some familiar names, and a very warm welcome for those who are joining us here for the first time. My name is Catherine from Optimal Hong Kong, and I will be your host today. So in this presentation, we will investigate some of the findings from a global study that Hogan launched earlier in this year. The global study actually looks to identify what leadership qualities employees values most across various countries and cultures. Because this is still an ongoing study, so correct me if I'm wrong from the Hogan team, the presentation today will share some of the earlier findings, or at least based on the data that we have now, to disclose what are some of the employee expectation, how does it align, or how does it differ from the personality patterns of senior leaders today. So while the Hogan team will share with us some general global trends from their findings, we will also do a deeper dive into some of the discoveries on the distinctive leadership expectations within the APAC area, specifically Greater China and Japan, to learn what this means for organizations in building strong, future-ready leaders and high-performing teams. So for today's presentation, as you can see, we are very fortunate to have Ms. Krista Pederson, the Managing Director, APAC, and Ms. Nicole Dickie, Senior Consultant from Hogan, to join us today. So from Optimal, I have myself, and as you can see, my colleagues from other countries in this session as well. So as we are going through the presentation, if there are any questions, any comments about the topic, please feel free to scan the QR code that will be shown later in the presentation slides. And also, we will also be sharing that in the chat box as well. So we will aggregate all these questions, all these comments, and we will have a Q&A session in the end. So without any further delay, I will pass the time to Krista and Nicole to begin.
Catherine, thank you so much. It's wonderful to be with you this morning. Thank you for taking your time out of your schedules to learn with us and discuss these really interesting findings. So as Catherine kindly mentioned, my name is Nicole Dickie, Senior Consultant with Hogan Assessments in APAC, and I'm joined with my amazing leader and colleague, Krista Pederson, Managing Director, APAC. And we're really excited for the findings that we've got to share today. We do have a pretty packed agenda. So we'll start by talking about Hogan's point of view on leadership. We'll then move into the global findings from our study, move to a deep dive into Japan and mainland China's findings, and finally end with some key takeaways and time for Q&A. And as Catherine mentioned already, this is the QR code. Please feel free to scan, submit your questions as they come up throughout the time. And as she shared, I believe Vince will be sharing a QR code in the chat as well. So feel free to scan there. So as we get started, if you're not familiar with Hogan Assessments, Hogan's a global test publisher and consulting firm with really the goal to provide you data-driven insights on your talent so that you can beat that competition in the market. We operate through over 200 partners, one of which our wonderful distributor in Hong Kong, in China, in Japan, Singapore, Malaysia is Optimal Consulting. So thank you again, Catherine and team, for the opportunity to share. We have assessments and reports in over 50 languages, but at our heart, we are a research institution. We're a research organization. We'll share some research findings here in a minute. We have over 1,600 research findings using our assessments and a massive archive of performance data from around the world, and particularly on leaders. Leadership is really the heart of today's conversation and one of the driving forces of Hogan generally. Now, Dr. Hogan famously explains this linkage between the quality of people's lives to their leaders. You can see on the screen here the quote, "The quality of people's lives depends on their careers. The quality of their careers depends on organizations, and the fate of organizations depending on leaders, depending on their leadership." Leadership matters deeply for the experiences of employees, as well as real-world organizational outcomes. Gallup has the statistic that 70% of the variance of someone's experience at work is explained by their leader, by their direct leader. So we know that this is of critical importance to the experience of employees, to their motivation, to their engagement, and to their performance. Interestingly, research shows that a CEO accounts for 30% of a company's performance. So that top executive's strategy, initiative taking, decision making, these are all going to factor into the company's real world performance outcomes. We also see that, that effective leaders can double an organization's profits. And finally, the last little bullet here, leader performance has a direct impact on real world outcomes from org effectiveness, firm financial performance, innovation. And the importance of leadership makes sense when you consider our humans' evolutionary history, right? Humans have evolved in groups. And at the top there, you can see leadership is an evolved solution for organizing collective behavior to survive. So you can imagine in a tribe, a leader is organizing the tribe together to beat the external, a different tribe, in a competition for resources and ultimately a competition for survival. And when we think of this evolutionary past, this really brings us to two different facets or 2 points of view on leadership that we'll talk about very shortly: emergent leadership and effective leadership. So emergent leaders are those leaders who gain positions of power. They're very good at politicking. They're good at influencing, building relationships with others, networking with others. We often see that they can be charming and charismatic and influential. So these people are good at going through the organization, through the tribe, to gain positions of power. But what we see is that only 10% of emergent leaders are actually effective leaders, which we'll talk about in just a minute. But what we do find is that personality characteristics that help people get into positions of leadership in a given country are actually going to look differently. This makes sense because organizations in a country are operating under different rules, different laws, different governance. So the people who are rising to the top of an organization might look a little differently given the rules and structure of those organizations. So the behaviors that are rewarded through promotion look different country by country. When Krista shares in a little bit, we're going to get a deep dive into what emergent leaders look like in Japan and mainland China. So we'll explore that very shortly. Emergent leaders contrast with who is effective at leading. So from Hogan's point of view on leaders, effective leaders build and maintain a high-performing team. So again, when we think of our evolutionary past being in a tribe, those who were effective at leading the tribe, organizing to get resources, get food, beat the other competition, in today's organizations, effective leaders are those who are attracting really high-quality talent, organizing the work so that the work gets done effectively, and then beating the external competition. So from Hogan's perspective, leadership should be a resource for the followers, not a point of privilege for the leaders themselves. The point of leadership is for the team, being a resource for the team. So as we already said, those who are emergent leaders are not always effective leaders. And this goes back to personality. Dr. Hogan famously said that who you are is how you lead. A person's personality is going to show how they are likely to behave and likely to lead. And this brings us to Hogan's perspective, Hogan's conceptualization of personality. Hogan has a very wide and deep, comprehensive perspective of personality. The first being the bright side of personality. These are your day-to-day strengths. This is likely how you're going to show up to an interview Or if we were in person and networking, this is the you that you're bringing to work on a great day, right? And this helps us to understand if a leader can do the job, do they have the everyday strengths to fulfill the aspects of the role? The next is the dark side, the Hogan Development Survey. These are what behaviors emerge when you're 6 months, 1 year into a role. When the pressure's finally on, maybe when you get bored, or generally when you stop self-monitoring. We often think of these as overused strengths. Something that's going to derail your career, inhibit your team's success, or maybe even get you fired. This answers the question, what is going to get in your way of success? And then finally, the motives, values, and preferences inventory. These are a leader's drivers, motivators, what gets them up to go to work in the morning, and what kind of leadership culture or organizational team culture are they likely to create. So this brings us to our study at hand. We introduce the bright side, the dark side, and the inside, because that's the way that we're going to be looking at the data moving forward. So Hogan has years of data on leaders at hand, which we'll talk about in a minute. But we really wanted to understand what makes an effective leader. How do we find out about effective leaders? Well, we decided that we were going to ask employees, ask the people themselves. And this is because people intuitively know what makes a good or a bad leader through their experiences at work, through their experiences with a coach, in school, through the media, through other influential sources. People come to their own ideas of what characteristics makes a leader. So they form this idea, this prototype of a leader in their own mind. And then people evaluate their current leader at work based on this prototype of leadership. And when that aligns, really positive outcomes follow, like motivation, like engagement, like a willingness to follow, like performance. When it's misaligned, we don't see the positive benefits flow. And this is really important because research shows that 70% of employees are disengaged at work. So oftentimes we see leaders pressing down strategy, what they should be doing, but we want to pause and say, why are people disengaged? What do people actually need and want from their leaders at work? What kind of leader do people want to follow? Now, this is not to say that we should hire everyone who looks like the data we're about to show, but this is an opportunity to pause and listen and consider the needs of employees to increase engagement, to build higher performing teams, and to retain employees. So this brings us to our findings today. We're going to be looking at 2 key sources of data. I'm going to share the global findings. Krista will share the local findings. So first, we're going to be looking at our executive benchmark. So this delves into the trends of those who are currently in power. These are the leaders that we already have on the left-hand side, the leaders we have. These are emergent leaders. This is a representative sample globally in Japan and in mainland China. And this shows us the personality trends of those in power, emergent leaders. The second source of data is from our Global Leadership Effectiveness Study. We've asked respondents around the world what characteristics and behaviors are good or bad for leaders. So this data shows us what do people around the world think make an ideal and effective leader? What are the needs that they have and who do they want to follow? Okay, so let's jump into our global findings. So first, we're looking at the bright side. These are the leaders that we have. This is a representative sample of over 21,000 executives to show us key trends of global executives. So Executives around the world tend to be higher ambition, being more competitive, driven, setting these big, audacious goals, stretch goals. Higher sociability, so able to build networks inside and outside the organization. They tend to be more verbose, willing to speak, but they also still can listen. Higher interpersonal sensitivity, more communicating with that tact, warmth, and diplomacy, but it's not so high that they are afraid of confrontation. Higher inquisitive, so a little higher on the scale when we look at the benchmark, being open to ideas, being curious about how things work, but not being so lost in ideas in a day-to-day basis, still having a bit of pragmatism. And then finally, higher learning approach. So valuing continuously learning, developmental opportunities, and generally enjoying learning in a traditional way. So these are the leaders that we have. Next, let's look at the leaders that we want on the bright side. So this is over 8,000 respondents on our global survey. They've shared with us that they believe ideal leaders are higher ambition, having that drive, energy, and goal orientation. Are higher inquisitive, having that strategic mindset, being curious. And are higher interpersonal sensitivity, that diplomacy, tactfulness, and warmth, that warm communication. So when we compare side by side, we see that there is general alignment on the bright side between the leaders that we have and the leaders that we want. We want someone driven, our leaders are driven. We want someone sensitive, our leaders tend to be sensitive, but don't shirk confrontation. We want someone innovative, strategic, curious. We see that openness to ideas and curiosity. So now let's move to the dark side. These are the leaders that we have, a sample of 18,000 on this one. We see that global executives around the world tend to be higher on Hogan's moving towards cluster, also known as the charisma cluster, as we said, that being influential. So what we see is that in times of stress and pressure, global executives tend to derail in being higher bold. So confident, assertive, self-absorbed, maybe being less willing to listen to feedback. Higher mischievous, being charming, limit testing, risk-taking, maybe politicking, manipulating. Higher colorful, or being dramatic, attention-seeking, always wanting the spotlight, maybe not sharing that recognition with the team, or not always listening. And then finally, higher imaginative. So being eccentric, full of zany or unconventional ideas, maybe having a hard time actioning on those ideas as well. So these are the leaders that we have. Now we're looking at, what do respondents say they don't want? 8,000 of respondents said, well, we don't want a leader who is emotionally volatile or going to be unpredictable. We want someone who's stable emotionally. Respondents don't want a leader who is passive aggressive or resistant. They want someone who is going to say what they do and do what they say. Next is respondents don't want someone high bold, being arrogant or entitled. And finally, respondents don't want a leader who is extremely cautious, is unwilling to make a decision, and who is spiraling in the data. Now, let's look at this comparison. We see on the left-hand side, our global executives tend to be emotionally controlled and tolerant. And that's great because that's what respondents have asked for, that emotional stability, that emotional control. We see that current leaders are decisive and communicative, that lower cautious, that aligns with what respondents want. They're open and honest. They're going to do as they say and say as they do, which is what respondents want. The mismatch, the misalignment is actually on bold. What we see is that global executives, as we've said, are higher bold, tend to be that confident, aggressive, maybe unwilling to listen to feedback. Global respondents want that leader who's a bit more humble, a bit more modest, and who's open to other ideas. We'll finish out the global findings here on the MVPI. This is a sample, representative sample of 16,000 respondents, 16,000 executives. What we see here is that the benchmark is not quite as high as what we've seen on the bright side and dark side. Okay, so there's not one specific motivator for executives. The trends that we do see is a little bit higher on aesthetics. So this desire for quality, creative self-expression, a really a form over function kind of work product. We also see higher trends on tradition, valuing particular ways of behaving, convention. We've done it this way. Let's keep, let's honor our traditions, honor the way things have been done. Higher power, which makes sense, valuing that authority, that influence, that having an impact. We also see higher commerce, also makes sense, wanting to earn a profit. There is a bit of moderate finding, a 51 on affiliation. This means that executives around the world, they're okay with working with a team as well as working autonomously. Finally, what we see is a little lower score on science. So science deals with, wanting data and rationality. So a little bit lower science is going to say, hey, our leaders want experience-based. They'll make decisions based on experience and intuition over and above data and rationality. And when we look at what global respondents have shared, first of all, a quick note here, the percentage of endorsement on any given value is actually lower. So you'll see that the two that we've called out here are only 48% of respondents have endorsed. That's much lower than what we saw on the bright side or the dark side. That suggests to us that values are much more individual. But we wanted to call these two out because they were the higher endorsement. That global respondents are saying, hey, we want to feel belonging. We want to work with the team. We want to feel connected. And we want our leaders to make decisions based on data, having a data-driven decisions, using analysis, really being thoughtful in that decision-making process. And so what we see when we compare the leaders that we have and the leaders that we want, there's the alignment, general alignment on affiliation, being able and willing to build that community, build that teamwork, but the misalignment being on science, with current executives valuing experience and intuition, again, leaning on the ways that we've done things, and global respondents saying, we want data and analysis. Okay, from there, I am going to pass it over to Krista to share a deep dive into Japan and Greater China, Mainland China. Krista?
Yes, thank you, Nicole. I think that the global data is absolutely fascinating. If you're thinking about an average global person around the world, it's good to know and hear the trends around the world. But our research actually shows that it can be more meaningful to look at the country data. And we can look at these data from a lot of different perspectives, but we chose to look from the country perspective because we think that could be very meaningful in helping people understand how to do business a bit better across these markets. One stereotype that we often encounter is that regions tend to be the same. So for example, in the US, a lot of people are like, oh, Asia, they just do different business differently in Asia. But anyone who has ever worked and lived in Asia knows that that is not the case. Each individual market has their own special, unique way of doing business. And a lot of the challenges that we're facing as talent professionals, as practitioners in these markets, are helping to know how leaders can succeed across different markets. I'm actually based in mainland China, and I have been for about 15 years. And one of the biggest questions we have going out that companies face in mainland China is, how do we effectively do business across the region in different countries? There's a lot of businesses going to Japan. There's a lot of businesses going to Thailand. Likewise, we see the same thing in Singapore. Singapore is a very international and global country as well. And we're seeing people everywhere in Asia, we are seeing that we have to do business across borders. And especially with Asia becoming really the economic center of the world, it's more and more important that we understand from a country perspective what the leadership expectations are, so that when we go to mainland China, when we go to Japan, when we go to these countries, we really know what makes them unique and what the differences are in leadership. And if we know that, then we can more effectively lead people in these markets. So again, we're going to take a look at the leaders we have versus the leaders that people want, the leaders we want. And we'll take a look using the global leaders kind of as a benchmark for what are people generally around the globe looking like. And then we'll look at Japan and Greater China, what the leaders we have are. And then we'll take a look at the results from the leaders we want. And we'd love to present more. We actually have 25 different countries that we had complete our survey. And so Japan and Greater China had really good survey response. So we're going to present those two today. For people who are in other markets, if we're hearing Thailand, Malaysia, Singapore, we would love to get more data on these markets so we can present the findings as well. Great. Could you help me switch to the next slide, Nicole? So we're starting out with the leaders we have. And again, these are representative samples, so we can confidently say this is what executives look like, either average around the globe or for Japan and China. And again, anyone who's done business across these markets know that they are different. There is no such thing as an Asian leadership profile. So when we're looking at Japan, some really interesting differences pop up. You're seeing a little bit higher of adjustment on executives. So executives who are remaining cool, calm, and collected under stress. A little bit lower for China, but from an ambition perspective, so having that drive and push to succeed, we're seeing that Japan is actually a little bit lower. And both Japan and China are scoring lower than the global executives, which is not to say executives in Japan and China are not having ambition, or they don't have the drive to succeed. What we're seeing in China, and especially in Japan, is a more consensus style of leadership. So let's discuss a topic together, make some decisions as an executive team, and then move forward based on that. Also, interestingly, we're seeing a trend for lower on interpersonal sensitivity in China. And so Japan is more similar, Japanese leaders are more similar to the global means. But in China, we're seeing leaders who are speaking directly to their teams. They're not afraid to correct their teams. They are leaders who will tell their teams directly. And another way to think about it is they're focused more on tasks rather than people. Whereas globally and in Japan, we're seeing people that leaders tend to be focused a bit more on people and caring about what other people think and being warm and friendly in the communication, and less on just getting the task done. Finally, we're seeing a little bit higher on inquisitive and learning approach for Chinese leaders. And so these are kind of interesting trends. And in Japan, we're seeing a lot lower on learning approach for Chinese leaders. So when we're looking at the leaders we want versus the leaders we have, we'll take a look at Japanese respondents and what they said. So interestingly, Japanese respondents rated interpersonal sensitivity, being diplomatic, tactful, and sensitive as their most desired characteristics in their leaders. They also mentioned that inquisitive is important, They wanted their leaders to continuous learn and promote continuous learning with that high learning approach. And they're wanting leaders who are resilient and optimistic. So those are what Japanese leaders or Japanese respondents said they wanted out of their leaders. Now from China, it's quite interesting because we're actually seeing a little bit differences in China. So going to the next slide. Yes, this slide. So actually, instead of prioritizing interpersonal sensitivity or diplomacy tact in China, people want leaders who can drive. They want leaders who have energy, who are goal-oriented and can push things forward. Second most important was this continuous learning or learning approach. So they want leaders who can create opportunities for learning and who will support continuous learning in their organizations. We're also seeing, and again, we didn't see this in Japan, but focus on process, organization, creating structure. So a lot of people want their leaders to not only create a plan, to have really ambitious goals, but they also want leaders to provide structure to be able to achieve those goals. And finally, they're wanting leaders who are strategy focused, casting a vision, thinking about how to make things better. So this is Chinese respondents. And if we're looking at them, a few unique insights are, as I mentioned before, Japanese respondents don't seem to prioritize ambition or being individually goal-driven as a leader, promoting my agenda and pushing for stronger goals. That wasn't as important for Japanese participants. And again, if you remember, that was very important for Chinese participants in the survey. Also, again, Chinese respondents are not prioritizing that interpersonal sensitivity. So they actually don't mind having leaders that are task focused and leaders that are trying to push to get things done rather than being concerned about how people feel. And so if we're looking at them side by side, we see some really interesting uniques. When you're leading Japanese teams, it's important that kindness and calmness is key. So Japanese participants really want leaders who can remain calm under pressure. They want leaders who are more considerate and who are more curious and creating a sense of an environment where they can seek knowledge and actually have some ideas and be creative. Here on the slide, if we're just looking at the slide, the check mark is where Japanese leaders actually fulfill these characteristics. Interestingly enough, we are seeing that Japanese leaders are not necessarily more considerate. They aren't necessarily more curious, and they're not necessarily more knowledge-seeking on a day-to-day basis. When it comes to leading Chinese teams, strategy and driving performance is key. And so Chinese participants want a leader that can inspire, they want a leader that can actually support them to drive for really intense goals. And so again, if you're thinking about how we lead different teams across different regions, it will be really important that if you're a Chinese leader that's going to Japan, you're going to have to take a step back and kind of tone down the energy a bit, because Japanese teams want leaders who are kind, who are more calm, who are actually supporting from that consensus-driven leadership, the team's perspective and creating group harmony. Whereas in China, if a Japanese leader was going to China to lead, they're actually going to have to probably bring a little bit more energy instead of being so concerned about the team morale and making sure that we're moving forward together. Chinese participants in the survey have actually expressed that they want a leader who is driving things, who's providing the structure to get that done, and who's actually supporting continuous learning. So if we're looking at the Chinese leaders we have versus what we want, we see that Chinese leaders are actually tend to be more curious and innovative, and they tend to have that environment where they're continuously learning and pushing for that. However, Chinese leaders in China can also work on being more driven, goal-oriented, sharing that with the team, and also can be work on creating more structure to help their teams succeed at those goals that they need to drive. So that's from a bright side perspective, the day-to-day strengths and weaknesses. But next, we're going to look at the dark side. So if we're looking at a few trends, we're looking at two in particular that are popping out. And one is that Japanese leaders tend to be very high on cautious, especially compared to Chinese and global leaders. Interestingly enough, this is where looking at leader personality data can break some stereotypes. So if we're looking at diligent, which is about perfectionism, micromanaging, making sure that we're getting things right, to make sure that we have a perfect product, that would be under diligent. And I know that a lot of people tend to think that Japanese and Japanese society is very, very detail oriented and paying attention to the details. But our data shows that actually leaders tend to be lower on diligent. And maybe it's because the attention to detail is already built into the structure of the society. And so leaders don't need to show that. However, our data is very interesting because we're seeing that Japanese leaders are very high on cautious. So all of the attention to detail and the attention to not making a mistake is driven from more of a perspective of we're afraid of losing face. We're afraid of making a mistake in front of other people and maybe feeling foolish. And so we're seeing really leaders in Japan tend to be higher on cautious. And interestingly, from a Chinese perspective, the one derailer that we're seeing really spiking is bold. And so you can see in Japan, leaders are lower on bold. Globally, leaders, as Nicole shared before, tend to be a little bit higher on bold. But in China, we're seeing that they're very, very high on bold. So it's about taking charge and being viewed as an authority, being reluctant to admit one's mistakes, not being willing to change course or listen to feedback, kind of assuming one is right, which is very interesting because if you recall, the Chinese leaders from a day-to-day bright side perspective tend to be a little bit lower on ambition. But when it comes to being under stress and pressure and when they're not self-monitoring, they tend to be willing to take that authority, that position of authority. Okay, so these are the leaders we have in Japan and China. Let's look at what people in those markets really don't want from their leaders. So in Japan, we found that most participants really didn't want leaders who have those moving away from scales or characteristics that cause people to and leaders to be tend to separate them from their leaders. So for example, they really don't want leaders who are emotionally volatile, who are unpredictable, who get really excited about projects and then drop them, and who tend to be emotionally abusive. And again, this is really related to, there was a campaign in Japan just recently about harassment at the workforce. People in Japan really don't want leaders who are bullies. They don't want leaders who are harassing their superiors. So they don't want those people who are like emotionally volatile. Also, they really don't want leaders who are high on bold. And so they really value humility and not being willing to admit when they're wrong and taking a different route forward. So again, we're seeing for Japanese participants, excitable, bold, leisurely, being passive aggressive, being reserved, being tough and uncommunicative. Japanese participants really didn't like those. And then again, interestingly enough, they didn't want people who were high on cautious, which sneak preview, we know that Japanese leaders tend to be higher on cautious. And so participants were saying, we know that our leaders are like that, but we don't really care for that in our leadership. I put a red square around the ones that were similar to Chinese leaders. So going to the next slide, we're going to look at Chinese participants. I'm sorry. So from our Chinese respondents, they believe that ideal leaders should not demonstrate excitableness. So again, that emotional volatility and unpredictability. Cautious, so they also don't want their leaders to be afraid of making mistakes, to be too cautious, to want more and more data before making a decision, so being slow to take risks and make decisions. And they also don't want leaders who are high on arrogance and entitlement. So if we're looking at China versus Japan, when we're leading Japanese teams, again, they're wanting a leader who is calm, who is honest, Also, we found in our data they wanted leaders who were detailed. So not from a detailed about afraid of making mistakes, and so going over the data over and over again. No, they're wanting leaders who are actually a little bit higher on diligent, people who are actually willing to take a closer look at their work. So this was quite interesting from a Japanese perspective. And we are seeing that leaders in Japan tend to be more emotionally controlled and tolerant, tend to be more cooperative and candid generally, and again, tend to be more humble and unassuming with that lower on bold, but the leaders are not more risk-taking. They are afraid to make decisions, and they tend not to be as attentive to the details and hand-holding to their teams. From a Chinese perspective, Chinese participants really want leaders who are calm, who are open with their teams, emotionally vulnerable, who make decisions in a timely manner, but they also want leaders who are humble. And again, we're seeing that leaders are in China tend to be a little bit more emotionally controlled, so a little bit lower on excitable. They also tend to be a little bit lower on cautious, so they are decisive and tend to communicate with their teams. However, it's that bold scale where we're seeing a little bit of a mismatch between what people want and what leaders tend to be like. So from a perspective in China, leaders should consider trying to figure out ways to be more humble, to listen to others' feedback, to be willing to be open to hearing others' opinions and not just going what they feel they know is right because they're an authority. Okay. And so finally, we're going to take a look at the inside. So what leaders really value. And we're seeing two very unique trends across these two markets. So number one, we are seeing that as a general rule of thumb, Japanese leaders are lower on most values, except for a little higher on hedonism, so that work hard, play hard, and a little bit higher on aesthetics. So wanting a sense of beauty, wanting a sense, having form, being caring about the quality. Interestingly enough, you can see the exact opposite trend in China. Leaders tend to be higher, quite high on most all of the values. Security is one of the lower values that we're seeing, but it's still above the 50th percentile. So leaders tend to be very high on most of the values in China. But in particular, one that I'm going to point out is the value of aesthetics. And when we go into the next slide, we'll see why. So in Japan, the leaders we want tend to be higher on affiliation, hedonism, and a little bit higher on science. But again, similar to the global leader trends, we aren't seeing huge spikes in any of these values. So if you looked at the HDS or the HPI, we're seeing that Japanese respondents have very strong feelings about what they want and don't want. We're seeing up to 80% consensus around excitable. They don't want a leader that's excitable, up to 70% consensus around wanting a leader that's not high on leisurely or reserved. And even on the HPIs, we're seeing really high consensus about what we want for a leader being high on interpersonal sensitivity, et cetera. But on the values perspective, we aren't seeing a huge consensus here. However, it is worth saying that a lot of Japanese people especially want that sense of teamwork and belonging. But we are seeing quite a few people are wanting hedonism, and there is a small spike with regards to science. Now, from Chinese respondents wanted the same thing as the Japanese respondents with affiliation, hedonism, science, but Chinese respondents also wanted their leaders to demonstrate that sense of creativity, self-expression, dedication to quality, dedication to the look and feel of things with higher on aesthetics. So when we're looking at again, a few unique insights with regards to this is that no one value is really popping. Other than that sense of affiliation with regards to Japanese leaders having that above the 50th percentile, we're seeing that everything is trending a little bit lower on the values, which, as Nicole pointed out, we believe that it's because values tend to be quite individual, and people actually are maybe projecting their own values and what they want in their leaders. And so we're seeing a lot more variation and less consensus on any one value being the most important across these markets. On to the next slide. So if we are leading teams in Japan and China, again, pulling at that overall theme for leading Japanese teams. They're wanting leaders who can create an innovation friendly, data driven environment where people really want to come to work and feel that sense of belonging. And we see this across the entire results of the GLES study. We're seeing that they want leaders who are high on learning approach, high on inquisitive, driving that innovation, driving that sense of continuous learning, and also valuing science, so valuing using data to support those initiatives. We're also seeing that from a Japanese perspective, more of a focus on people above tasks. So they're wanting high on affiliation, a sense of belonging, high on interpersonal sensitivity, leaders that can really be kind and thoughtful, creating that sense of a team. And we're seeing that from the HDS perspective, they're wanting leaders who tend to be lower on those moving away from scales, plus humble. And so when you go to Japan and are leading a Japanese team, this is the type of leader that they're wanting, a very people-focused, innovation-friendly, data-driven leader. And that will really get you far. It's less focused on achieve, driving for success, and more focused on creating that sense of belonging, creating a place that's friendly to support innovation that gives you opportunities for continuous learning. From a Chinese perspective, we are seeing that people want to create beautiful, innovation-friendly, data-driven environments where people want to come to work, but also with that sense of drive. Also, they want to have a place where they can actually achieve really strong goals with that, one for a leader who's high in ambition, and also a leader who can support that by providing more structure with that sense of prudence. Also a leader who is more emotionally open and vulnerable. And we're seeing that again with that sense, wanting a sense of affiliation, wanting less on the moving away from scale. So we're wanting someone that is more open, and then someone that's willing, a leader that's willing to admit when they're wrong. So you can see that each market has some similar trends here, but each market also has their unique ways in which they want to be led. And it's so important that we focus on this and that we ask people what they want in their leaders. So going on to the next slide, actually. We think it's so important to really ask your teams what you need for your leaders, because exactly what Nicole said before, people have their own concept of what makes a good or a bad leader. And even though we know that there's other ways that you can measure leader effectiveness, we do know that there's a huge engagement problem across the world. And being able to meet the expectations of what people want in their leaders is one way that you can really increase engagement and increase performance outcomes. We know that engagement is related to all sorts of positive performance outcomes. And so what we would like to present to you today is the opportunity to actually do this at your own organizations if you're interested. This, again, is great from a overall country perspective. We think that different nuances are important to know, especially if you're doing different business across different markets. However, you can also recreate this study at your own organization to understand what your talent is wanting from their leaders. And you can actually develop your leaders based on that. So for example, if you have a team that is really wanting a leader that is more people focused rather than task focused, that wants leaders who are higher on interpersonal sensitivity, then, and you have a leadership team that's lower on interpersonal sensitivity, you're probably going to want to develop that leadership team in people skills areas. So actually doing this survey at your own organization can help you really understand how to develop your leaders in a way that makes them more effective at supporting their teams and driving engagement. So if you're interested, please contact Optimal. We are offering this study for free at this point in time. And so it's a really great way that you can participate if you're very interested in learning how you can do this at your organization. The caveat is you do need 10 or more people to participate. We want to keep the answers anonymous. We don't want to call out, any one or two people. And we also would like the more people to be representative of what people think at your organization. But it is something that we are offering that can help you improve your leader effectiveness at your own organization. So going on to the next slide. Some key takeaways just to leave you with. We know that leadership is critical for organizational success. We also see some overlap, but also some gaps in who leads versus the people, in who people want to follow. And so you can actually, if you want to look at this gap for your own organization, you can assess everyone on Hogan. You can assess your leaders on Hogan and recreate this study by assessing your leaders on Hogan, understanding their scores, and then taking this free survey to ask people what they want. And then you can create actionable insights to support leaders leading at your own organization. You can also do this if you're sending a leader abroad. If you are curious about, how I should prepare this leader to lead more effectively in a particular country, this can be very, very helpful. So for example, if you have a leader that's going to go to Japan, understanding that teams are wanting a leader that's less focused on drive and more focused on really supporting the team morale, creating innovation, will really get them far. And so finally, we know that leaders who listen to what followers want, who act on that feedback, and who are committed to continuous improvement can really increase engagement to support high-performing teams and to drive better results for your organization. Thank you.